To begin making your collar with collar stand, you will need a piece of fabric that, when folded, is big enough to fit your two pattern pieces. Being that you will need one of your two collar pieces to have interfacing and one of your two stand pieces to have interfacing, now is a good time to go ahead and apply the interfacing before we've cut anything out. With the fusible side down, iron your interfacing to the folded fabric using steam. I like to use a generic lightweight fusible interfacing for this. Now we can trace our two paper patterns onto our folded interfaced fabric. Don't forget to mark those notches. Those are going to be important when we go to sew later. Before I start cutting, I pin the two layers of fabric together to help prevent anything from shifting while I'm cutting. Clip all notches at about 1/8 of an inch into the fabric. Without even needing to unpin the two collar pieces, we're going to take it directly over to the sewing machine and begin sewing. If you start with the interfaced piece face up, it's going to be easier to sew because it's going to keep your presser foot from wanting to push your two layers of fabric away from each other. For this pattern, it calls for using a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, which is what the little notch on the pattern is indicating to me. Sew around 3 of the 4 sides of the collar. The 4th side will later get sewn to the collar stand. One trick that I use to help me get the sharpest collar points that I can possibly get is to include one 45-degree angle stitch right at that corner of the collar tip. That, along with clipping the seam allowance around the corners, is going to help this collar sit as nice as possible. Now you can turn your collar right side out and do your best to work out those little corner points. I like to rub them in between my fingers, as well as using a straight pin to work out the last remaining bits of the point. Although be careful when you do this because it can be really easy to pull threads from the fabric through, so proceed with caution. Return to the iron and begin pressing your collar. I start by pressing the seam open first and then folding it into its final state. Pro tip here is to attempt to roll the side seam of the collar slightly under so that when we're wearing the finished garment, you don't see the side seam at all. Since the interfaced piece is going to be the part that sits underneath the collar when we're wearing the garment, we want the side seam to roll to that side. So with the interfaced piece facing you on the ironing table, you want to just pull just slightly down to where you see the side seam and then hit it with the iron. Top stitch around your 3 sides at 1/4 inch. Grab your interfaced collar stand piece and head back to the iron. I know, if we were smart, we would have ironed this while we were standing up here ironing the collar, but we're not, and that's okay. You're going to press back 3/8 of an inch along the whole bottom of this piece. The bottom side is like the bottom of the smiley face. Now stitch down that folded edge. Now you want to mark the center of your collar and 2 collar stand pieces. I like to do this by folding the piece in half and cutting a teeny tiny little V right at the center, but not too deep because you only want this to be in your seam allowance. These are going to be used as sewing guides. Oh, and don't cut a hole through that folded edge that we just sewed. Now you can use those center notches to line up all 4 pieces. The collar will be sandwiched in between the 2 collar stands. Okay, stick with me for this next part. The interfaced collar stand piece will be directly touching the uninterfaced collar piece. And likewise, the interfaced collar piece will be directly touching the uninterfaced collar stand. You following? Trust me, this will make sense in a little bit. Pin all 4 layers together. Sew along this seam, starting at the bottom of the curve and ending at the bottom of the second curve. Now, some tips for sewing that curve because it is a tricky thing to sew nicely. First thing is you can lower your stitch length and you have more time to make a nice smooth curve. Also avoid lifting your presser foot because that makes it really easy to kind of add an angle into your curve. Things can get wonky because you start to lose the ability to follow your sewing guide on your machine. So if you're using the edge of your foot as a sewing guide, you want to be really careful to look directly to the right of the needle, basically like the middle of your presser foot, as opposed to looking at the front of your presser foot as you sew. And also, if the stitch looks wonky, you can always try again in just that one little part. Sometimes it's easier to start at the beginning of the curve or end at the curve. So try flipping it back and forth too and see if you like one side better. Grade the seam allowances just along these curves. Grading means trimming down the seam allowance to be narrower. This is going to enable the curve to actually curve when you turn it right side out. Likewise, you could also clip the curve. Either way works. Well, can you guess? We're back at the iron. We're pressing down that new seam that we just sewed, making sure that our curves are smooth and flat. It's really starting to look like a collar now. Once the shoulder seams are sewn on the body of your shirt, you're ready to attach the collar to the neck hole. Begin by running a stay stitch along this neck edge opening. This is going to prevent the neckline from stretching out as we stitch it to the collar. This stitch will eventually get hidden under your collar as long as you sew it at less than your prescribed seam allowance. Begin pinning the collar to the neckline, starting with the center point of the collar lining up with the center back of the shirt. And ideally, you have notches that show you where the collar lines up with each shoulder seam. Sew along this pinned edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, being careful to avoid catching the other folded back collar stand within the stitch. Finally, you're going to sew the collar stand shut. Now you get to see the value of why we pre-folded that one side of the collar stand, as well as ensuring that it's the one that's interfaced. Because now when we go to sew this, the presser foot is not going to fight with us and end up creating a torque in the fabric. I hate when that happens. Because you folded back the collar stand 3/8 of an inch and you sewed the other side of the collar stand at a 1/2 inch, this should overlap by 1/8 of an inch. Make sure as you're sewing along that you're spreading that seam open while also ensuring that the folded collar stand is covering that other stitch. You can also press this seam before you start sewing it, but apparently today I didn't bother pressing. Also, I recommend clipping the corners of the seam allowance at the beginning and end of your collar meeting the neckline to help reduce bulk. This stitch may look a little wonky on the outside of the collar stand, but most of this will get covered up by the collar, so who cares? Okay, finally, the seriously last stitch is to top stitch around the collar stand. I do about a 1/16 of an inch. And that's it. You did it. Pat yourself on the back, and you know you're about to try that on and be wearing some sort of flappy cape-like collar thing. Congratulations. Now get to work finishing the rest of that shirt. Until next time, happy sewing.